Sarah had lived in the same apartment for 3 years. It wasn't fancy, just a simple one-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, but it was hers, or at least it felt like hers. Every month, she paid her rent on time, never complained about the leaky faucet or the outdated appliances. She thought she was doing everything right. Then one day, an envelope arrived. Inside was a notice that her rent would be increasing by $400 a month. $400. That's groceries for a month. That's her car payment. That's the difference between saving for the future and living paycheck to paycheck. She sat on her worn couch staring at that paper and asked herself the same question millions of people around the world are asking right now. Why is rent increasing everywhere, and when will it stop? This isn't just Sarah's story. It's happening in New York and London, in Toronto and Sydney, in cities big and small across every continent. Rent has become the single largest expense for millions of people, and it's climbing faster than wages, faster than inflation, faster than anyone predicted. Young professionals are moving back in with their parents. Families are being pushed out of neighborhoods they've called home for generations. Teachers, nurses, service workers, the very people who keep our cities running, can no longer afford to live in the communities they serve. Something fundamental has shifted in how we think about housing, and the consequences are reshaping society in ways we're only beginning to understand. To understand why rent is skyrocketing everywhere, we need to start with the most basic principle of economics: supply and demand. It sounds simple, almost too simple to explain something as complex as a global housing crisis. But it's the foundation of everything else. In most cities around the world, there simply aren't enough homes and apartments for everyone who wants to live there. When demand exceeds supply, prices go up. It's not a conspiracy, it's just math. But here's where it gets interesting, and where we begin to see why this problem is so difficult to solve. Cities aren't building enough housing to keep up with population growth. In many major metropolitan areas, construction of new residential buildings has slowed to a crawl compared to previous decades. There are multiple reasons for this, and each one compounds the others. First, there's the issue of land. Cities, by their nature, have limited space. You can't just create new land in downtown Manhattan or central London. The most desirable locations, the ones close to jobs, transportation, schools, and amenities, are already built up. So developers are forced to look at more expansive options, tearing down older buildings to construct new ones, or building on less desirable land further from city centers. But even when land is available, building new housing has become extraordinarily expensive and complicated. Construction costs have soared in recent years. The price of lumber, steel, concrete, and other building materials has increased dramatically, partly due to supply chain disruptions, partly due to increased global demand, and partly due to inflation. Labor costs have also risen as there's a shortage of skilled construction workers in many markets. Electricians, plumbers, carpenters. These trades have an aging workforce and fewer young people entering the field. When you combine expensive materials with expensive labor, the cost of constructing a single apartment unit can easily reach hundreds of thousands of dollars in major cities. Then there's the regulatory maze. Don't get me wrong, building codes and safety regulations exist for good reasons. We want buildings that won't collapse, that have proper fire safety, that meet environmental standards. But over the decades, the regulatory requirements for new construction have multiplied. Environmental impact studies, parking requirements, setback rules, height restrictions, design review boards, community input sessions. The list goes on and on. Each requirement adds time and money to a project. A development that might have taken 2 years to complete 30 years ago can now take 5 or 6 years just to get through the approval process. And that's before a single shovel hits the ground. During those years, the developer is paying for the land, paying lawyers, paying consultants, and not generating any revenue. All of those costs eventually get passed on to renters. Perhaps even more significant than the direct costs are the restrictions on what can actually be built. Zoning laws in most cities severely limit where and what type of housing can be constructed. Large portions of many cities are zoned exclusively for single-family homes. This means that even if a developer wanted to build an apartment building in these areas, it would be illegal. They can't build a duplex. They can't build a townhouse. They certainly can't build a mid-rise apartment building. This single-family zoning often covers some of the most desirable residential areas in cities, areas that are close to good schools, parks, and transportation. By making it illegal to build denser housing in these neighborhoods, cities artificially restrict the housing supply. Who benefits from these restrictions? Primarily existing homeowners. If you own a house in a neighborhood zoned for single-family homes only, that zoning protects the character of your neighborhood and potentially the value of your property. If an apartment building can't be built next door, your views stay clear, traffic stays manageable, and the supply of housing in the area stays constrained, which helps keep property values high. This creates a powerful political constituency against changing zoning laws. Homeowners vote in local elections at much higher rates than renters, and they show up to city council meetings to oppose new development. Politicians listen to voters, and so the restrictions remain in place. But there's another side to the supply issue that's equally important, and this one has more to do with money than with physical buildings. Over the past few decades, housing has increasingly been treated not primarily as a place to live, but as an investment asset. This shift has fundamentally changed the housing market. Institutional investors, large corporations, and wealthy individuals have poured money into residential real estate, buying up properties not to live in them, but to generate returns. Private equity firms have purchased tens of thousands of single-family homes and apartment buildings. International investors park their money in real estate in stable cities, sometimes leaving properties empty because the investment value matters more than the rental income. When housing becomes an investment vehicle, the incentives change completely. If you're a corporation that owns thousands of rental units, your job isn't to provide affordable housing. Your job is to maximize returns for your shareholders. That means charging the highest rent the market will bear. It means keeping operating costs down. It means using sophisticated pricing algorithms that analyze the competition and adjust rents dynamically to optimize revenue. Some large property management companies now use software that monitors rental prices across the market in real time and automatically suggests rent increases based on what other landlords are charging. This kind of algorithmic pricing, some critics argue, can lead to a form of unintentional price coordination where all landlords end up raising rents at similar rates, even without explicitly agreeing to do so. The financialization of housing has another effect too. When investors believe that real estate will continue to appreciate in value, they're willing to pay more to acquire properties. This drives up the purchase price of buildings, and when a property changes hands at a higher price, the new owner needs to charge higher rents to cover their costs and generate their expected return. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. Investors buy properties because they expect values to rise. Their purchases drive values higher. Higher property values require higher rents. Higher rents make real estate look like an even better investment, and the cycle continues. Now let's talk about something that might seem disconnected from your rent payment but is actually intimately connected. Interest rates and monetary policy. For more than a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world kept interest rates at historically low levels. The goal was to stimulate economic growth, to make borrowing cheap so businesses would invest and consumers would spend. And it worked, but it had side effects. When interest rates are low, it becomes very cheap to borrow money. If you're a real estate investor, you can borrow money at 3 or 4% interest and use it to buy property that might generate a 6 or 7% return. That's free money, essentially. So investors borrowed heavily to buy real estate. Low interest rates also pushed investors toward assets like real estate in search of better returns. When savings accounts and government bonds are paying less than 1%, investors need to find something else to do with their money. Real estate became increasingly attractive. You could borrow cheaply, buy property, collect rent that exceeded your borrowing costs, and benefit from the property appreciating in value. This flood of investment money into real estate pushed prices higher and higher. And while low interest rates made it cheaper for people to buy homes with mortgages, they also made it more expensive for renters because all that investment money was competing for properties and driving up prices. Then, starting in 2022, inflation surged and central banks began raising interest rates aggressively to combat it. Now we're in a different situation. Higher interest rates mean higher mortgage payments for anyone buying a home. This has effectively priced many would-be home buyers out of the market. When you can't afford to buy a home, you have to rent. So demand for rental housing has increased precisely at a time when it was already in short supply. Meanwhile, higher interest rates have also made it more expensive for developers to borrow money to build new housing. So the very thing that might ease the supply shortage, new construction, has become less financially viable. There's another factor we need to consider, and this one is about demographics and changing patterns of how people live. In many countries, household sizes have been shrinking. People are having fewer children. Young adults are living independently rather than with extended family. Divorce rates mean that one household becomes two. All of these trends mean that even if the total population stays the same, the number of households increases, and each household needs a place to live. More households competing for the same number of housing units means higher prices. At the same time, there's been a massive shift in where people want to live. For decades, there was a migration from rural areas to cities as people sought better job opportunities and amenities. This urbanization put pressure on housing in cities. Then the COVID pandemic temporarily reversed this trend as remote work allowed people to move to smaller cities and suburban areas. But that created its own problems. Suddenly, cities that had relatively affordable housing saw an influx of higher-earning remote workers from expensive coastal cities. These remote workers could afford to pay more than the locals, and rents in these previously affordable areas shot up. The local teacher or retail worker who had always been able to afford a decent apartment suddenly found themselves competing with someone earning a Silicon Valley salary. We also need to talk about income inequality, because you couldn't understand the housing crisis without understanding how the gap between rich and poor has widened. Over the past few decades, income growth has been uneven. High earners have seen substantial wage increases, while wages for middle and lower income workers have barely kept pace with inflation. When high earners compete for housing in desirable areas, they can afford to pay much more. This pushes prices up across the board. A luxury apartment that rents for $5,000 a month sets a benchmark. Landlords of less luxurious apartments look at that price and think, well, maybe I can get $3,000 for my place. And the landlord of an older, more modest building thinks, I can probably get $2,000. The entire market gets pulled upward. This is especially visible in what economists call positional goods, things that are desirable partly because of their location or status. There are only so many apartments within walking distance of the best restaurants, the best schools, the best parks. High earners compete intensely for these prime locations, and their ability to pay premium prices affects the entire market. Even if you're looking for a modest apartment far from the trendy neighborhoods, you're still competing in a market where the top end has been pulled higher and higher. Another piece of the puzzle is the short-term rental market. Platforms like Airbnb have made it profitable for property owners to rent their places to tourists instead of long-term residents. In popular tourist destinations, significant numbers of apartments have been converted from long-term rentals to short-term vacation rentals. This removes housing from the permanent rental market, reducing supply and pushing up prices. A property owner can often make more money renting to tourists for a few nights at a time than to a long-term tenant. Some entire buildings in tourist-heavy cities have been converted to essentially informal hotels. The people who live and work in these cities find fewer and fewer options available to them. Government policy, or the lack of it, plays a crucial role too. In many places, there's been a retreat from public housing and affordable housing programs. Decades ago, governments built substantial amounts of public housing and offered significant subsidies for affordable housing development. Much of that has been scaled back or eliminated. The philosophy shifted toward letting the private market provide housing, with government playing a minimal role. But private developers build what's profitable, and what's most profitable is luxury housing for high earners. There's little incentive to build affordable housing without government subsidies or requirements. Some cities have inclusionary zoning laws that require developers to include a percentage of affordable units in new buildings, but these programs are often too limited in scope to make a significant dent in the problem. Rent control, which exists in some cities, is a contentious topic. Proponents argue that it protects tenants from sudden, massive rent increases and allows people to stay in their communities. Opponents argue that it discourages new construction and leads to housing shortages, because landlords have less incentive to maintain properties or build new ones if they charge market rates. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Rent control can protect existing tenants, but may have negative effects on the broader housing market if not carefully designed. Some cities have more sophisticated rent stabilization programs that allow for reasonable increases while preventing price gouging. But in places without any rent regulations, tenants have little protection against sudden, dramatic increases. There's also a psychological and cultural dimension to all of this. In many societies, homeownership has been promoted as the key to financial security and success. This has a couple of effects. First, it means that government policy often favors homeowners over renters. Tax deductions for mortgage interests, capital gains exemptions on primary residences. These policies make homeownership more attractive and indirectly make renting more expensive by comparison. Second, it means that renters are sometimes treated as second-class citizens in the housing market. Renters often have less legal protection, less political power, and less stability than homeowners. This cultural bias toward ownership means that renting is seen as a temporary state rather than a legitimate long-term housing choice, which affects how much attention policymakers pay to the rental market. Climate change is starting to play a role too, though this is still emerging. As certain areas become more vulnerable to wildfires, flooding, or extreme heat, people are migrating away from these higher-risk zones. This creates new demand pressures in areas considered safer or more climate-resistant. Coastal cities facing sea level rise, regions experiencing severe droughts, areas with increasing wildfire risk. All of these factors are beginning to influence where people want to live. The places that are seen as climate havens are experiencing increased demand, and rents in these areas are rising accordingly. Insurance costs are another factor that's becoming more significant. In areas prone to natural disasters, property insurance premiums have skyrocketed. Landlords pass these costs on to tenants in the form of higher rent. In some higher-risk areas, insurance is becoming difficult or impossible to obtain at any price, which affects property values and rental markets in complex ways. A building that's expensive to insure requires higher rents to be financially viable for the owner. Let's also consider the role of corporate consolidation in the rental market. As mentioned earlier, large corporations have been buying up rental properties at an unprecedented scale. When a handful of large companies control a significant portion of the rental market in a city, they have substantial pricing power. Even without explicitly colluding, these companies tend to follow similar strategies because they're all using similar data and analysis. They all want to maximize occupancy while also maximizing rent. This leads to a situation where rents across different properties owned by different companies tend to move in tandem. If one major landlord raises rents, others follow. Smaller landlords see what the big players are charging and adjust their own rents accordingly. Technology has changed the rental market in other ways too. Online listing platforms have made it easier to see what comparable apartments are renting for, which creates more transparency but also more competition. A decade or two ago, finding an apartment meant driving around neighborhoods looking for rent signs or relying on classified ads. You had less information about what others were paying. Now, you can instantly see every available apartment in your price range and compare them. It's convenient, but it also means that landlords can easily see what everyone else is charging and price accordingly. The market becomes more efficient, but efficiency in this case means that below-market deals are harder to find. The student housing market deserves special attention because it's particularly dysfunctional in many places. Universities have expanded enrollment without proportionally expanding on-campus housing. Students need to live somewhere, and they're often competing for the same rental housing as other residents. In college towns, this creates enormous pressure on the rental market. Landlords know students are desperate for housing and often charge premium prices for substandard conditions. Students typically rent in groups, which means a 3-bedroom apartment might house 5 or 6 people, each paying high rent for what amounts to very little space. Parents often co-sign leases and guaranteed rent payments, which makes students less price-sensitive than other renters might be. Landlords exploit this, knowing the rent will be paid even if it's unaffordable. Immigration patterns also affect local rental markets. This isn't about making a political statement. It's simply acknowledging that when people move to a new country or region, they need housing. Cities that are major destinations for immigrants experience additional demand pressure on their rental markets. This is particularly acute because newcomers typically rent rather than buy initially. They're also more likely to accept less than ideal housing conditions because they lack information about the market and their rights, or because they're simply grateful to have any housing at all. This makes them vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous landlords. We should also examine the role of speculation and expectation. In markets where real estate prices have been climbing for years, there's an expectation that they'll continue to climb. This expectation becomes self-fulfilling. Property owners hold on to their properties even if they could sell them, because they expect further appreciation. Potential sellers stay out of the market, reducing supply. Buyers rush in, afraid that if they wait, prices will be even higher. Renters stay in substandard housing rather than moving, because they fear that a new apartment will be even more expensive. All of these behaviors, driven by expectations about the future, affect the present market. The pandemic introduced new dynamics that are still playing out. During COVID, many people left expensive cities, temporarily easing rental markets in places like New York and San Francisco, but that proved temporary. As people returned to offices and city life resumed, demand surged back. Meanwhile, the pandemic had disrupted construction, with labor shortages and supply chain problems delaying projects. So when demand came roaring back, supply was even more constrained than before. This created a perfect storm of rapidly rising rents in 2021 and 2022. Some cities saw annual rent increases of 20 or even 30%, levels that were simply unsustainable for most people. Government responses to the pandemic also had mixed effects. Eviction moratoriums protected tenants from losing their homes during the crisis, which was humane and necessary. But when these moratoriums ended, many landlords raised rents aggressively to make up for lost revenue. Some sold their properties to larger investors who saw an opportunity. Small-scale landlords, sometimes called mom-and-pop landlords, who might have been more flexible with tenants, left the market in significant numbers. This consolidated ownership in the hands of larger, more corporate landlords who tend to be more aggressive about maximizing rents. Energy costs are another factor that feeds into rent increases. When heating oil, natural gas, and electricity prices rise, landlords face higher operating costs. These costs get passed through to tenants either directly, if utilities aren't included in rent, or indirectly through rent increases. The recent volatility in energy markets, driven by geopolitical events and the transition to renewable energy, has added another layer of cost pressure on housing. Property taxes are a significant expense for landlords, and when local governments raise property taxes, rents tend to rise in response. Cities facing budget pressures often look to property taxes as a revenue source. But this creates a difficult cycle. Higher taxes lead to higher rents, which leads to affordability problems, which creates pressure on local government to do something about housing costs. Meanwhile, the tax revenue might not be used in ways that actually increase housing supply or affordability. Maintenance and operating costs have also increased substantially. Everything from landscaping to pest control to property management services costs more than it used to. Modern tenants also have higher expectations than in the past. They expect a reliable internet, they expect packages to be handled securely, They expect responsive maintenance. Meeting these expectations requires infrastructure and staff. Landlords argue, with some justification, that they are providing more services than they used to, and that these services cost money. Of course, tenants might counter that they're repaying much more rent for apartments that are actually much better than they were a decade or two ago. Let's return to Sarah for a moment, our tenant who received that rent increase notice. What are her options? She could try to negotiate with her landlord, but in a tight rental market, the landlord knows that if Sarah leaves, someone else will take the apartment at the higher price. She could look for a cheaper apartment elsewhere, but she'll face moving costs, possibly a longer commute, and the risk that wherever she moves will raise the rent next year too. She could try to earn more money, get a better job or a second job, but there are only so many hours in a day. She could move in with roommates, sacrificing privacy and independence. She could move to a cheaper city, but that might mean leaving her job, her friends, her support network. None of these options are great. This is the reality for millions of people right now. So what's the solution? There's no single answer because this is a multifaceted problem, but we can identify some things that would help. Most fundamentally, we need to build more housing, a lot more housing. This means reforming zoning laws to allow denser development in places where people want to live. It means streamlining the approval process for new construction so it doesn't take half a decade to get a project approved. It means finding ways to reduce construction costs, perhaps through modular construction techniques or by training more construction workers. It means recognizing that every neighborhood needs to do its part, that wealthy areas can't opt out of accepting new housing. We also need to rethink how we finance and incentivize housing development. Government subsidies and tax credits for affordable housing need to be much more substantial. Public housing, which has been neglected and stigmatized, needs to be reinvented and invested in. There are examples from places like Vienna and Singapore where large-scale public housing programs provide affordable homes for a significant portion of the population. These aren't failure. They're successes that other places could learn from. Regulation of the rental market needs to be smarter. This doesn't necessarily mean strict rent control, which can have unintended consequences, but it does mean protections against sudden, massive rent increases. It means requiring good cause for eviction, so tenants have some stability. It means enforcing habitability standards so landlords can't let buildings deteriorate. It means limiting some of the most predatory practices in the industry. We need to address the treatment of housing as a pure investment asset. This is politically difficult because it requires challenging powerful interests, but policies could include higher taxes on vacant properties, restrictions on corporate ownership of single-family homes, limits on foreign investment in residential real estate, and regulations to prevent algorithmic price fixing. The goal isn't to eliminate all investment in housing, which is necessary and appropriate, but to rebalance things so that housing serves primarily as shelter for people rather than as a vehicle for financial speculation. Income inequality needs to be addressed through broader economic policy. When the gap between rich and poor widens, housing becomes increasingly unaffordable for those at the lower end. Higher minimum wages, stronger unions, more progressive taxation. These aren't just labor or tax issues, they're housing issues too. People need to earn enough to afford housing, or alternatively, housing needs to cost less relative to incomes. Cities need to invest in transportation infrastructure so that affordable housing further from city centers becomes more viable. If you can live 30 minutes outside the city but have a fast, reliable, affordable train that gets you downtown, that's a workable option. But if the only way to get to work is a 2-hour drive in traffic, that's not sustainable. Good public transportation effectively expands the housing market by making more areas accessible. We also need a cultural shift in how we think about housing. The American dream of home ownership isn't realistic or even desirable for everyone. There's nothing inherently wrong with renting in many European countries. Renting long-term is normal and accepted. Renters in these places often have much stronger legal protections and more stable housing situations. We need to stop treating renters as temporary residents who deserve stability or investment in their communities. Education and transparency around the rental market would help too. Many tenants don't know their rights or what constitutes a fair rent. Better data about rental prices, vacancy rates, and eviction patterns could empower tenants and inform policy. Some cities are starting to require landlords to register their rental units and report rents, which creates a database that researchers and policymakers can use. Climate adaptation needs to be part of housing policy going forward. As climate change makes certain areas less habitable, we need managed retreat and proactive planning for where people will live. Building in flood zones or fire-prone areas might have made sense historically but doesn't anymore. Investing in climate-resilient housing and infrastructure in safer areas could prevent future displacement crises. The student housing crisis requires universities to take more responsibility. If a university expands enrollment, it should provide housing for those additional students, or at least ensure adequate housing exists nearby. Some universities have started building much more on-campus housing, which is a positive trend that should accelerate. Ultimately, solving the rent crisis requires political will. It requires elected officials to stand up to incumbent homeowners who oppose new development. It requires challenging powerful real estate interests who benefit from the status quo. It requires spending government money on public housing and subsidies. It requires making hard choices about zoning and density and neighborhood character. These are all politically difficult, which is why progress has been slow. But the cost of inaction is enormous. When people can't afford housing, they become homeless or housing insecure. They can't save for the future. They can't start families. They can't take risks on education or entrepreneurship. The stress of housing insecurity affects mental and physical health. Children who move frequently because their families can't afford stable housing do worse in school. Communities lose diversity when only the wealthy can afford to live there. Essential workers can't afford to live in the communities they serve, leading to long commutes that waste time and resources and contribute to environmental problems. The rent crisis is also an economic crisis. When people spend 60 or 70% of their income on housing, they have nothing left to spend on other things. This hurts businesses and slows economic growth. It has a drag on productivity when workers spend 3 or 4 hours a day commuting, because they can't afford to live near their jobs. It is economically inefficient when cities that have lots of high-paying jobs queue in to track workers because housing is unaffordable. Sarah, sitting on her couch without rent increase notice, is part of a global phenomenon. Her individual struggle is connected to massive economic forces, policy failures, demographic changes, and cultural assumptions about housing. Understanding these connections doesn't make her rent any more affordable. But it does clarify that this isn't her failure. It's a system that's not working for millions of people, and systems can be changed. The rent increases we're seeing everywhere aren't inevitable. They're the result of choices we've made as societies about how to zone our cities, how to finance housing, how to regulate rental markets, how much to invest in public housing, how to treat housing as an asset versus as a human need. Different choices would lead to different outcomes. Places that have prioritized housing affordability and have been willing to challenge incumbent interests have managed to keep rents more reasonable as possible. It requires courage and commitment and a willingness to do things differently. The question isn't really why rent is increasing everywhere. We've answered that. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we willing to make the changes necessary to ensure that everyone has access to safe, decent, affordable housing? Are we willing to challenge the interests and assumptions that have created this crisis? The answer to those questions will determine whether the next generation faces an even worse housing situation, or whether we finally bend the curve and start moving toward a more just and sustainable housing system. Sarah and millions like her are waiting for that answer.